Hey all, Mooch here. Welcome to episode 5 of Minding Your mAhs. Today we're going to do the 3000 mAh Shootout, Sony VTC6, LG HG2, and the Samsung 30Q, but we're going to use not discharge graphs, well they're involved, but this is an introduction of the performance specifications which I'm adding to all my testing now, the watt hour and internal resistance. And we're going to use this Shootout to show how, without having to go to discharge graphs and compare multiple graphs and look up different numbers and try to calculate what might be better, you can just look, is the watt hours higher, is the internal resistance lower, and be able to pick the better performing battery that way. We should probably explain what a watt hour is. Very simply, a watt hour is just watts times hours. A watt is the volts times amps times the hours. For capacity, milliampere hours or amp hours, it's just amps times hours. In fact, it's built in here. So really what this is, in addition to just watt hours, is also our capacity and voltage. So not only does it take into account how long or how much energy is stored in the battery, but how well it delivers it. Namely, what voltage does it run at? And that gives us, using both of these, that gives us a much better idea of how that battery actually performs when being used. Now, with watt hours, you can sort out which battery might be the harder hitting one, or the longer running one, or both. And one example might be, let's say this is mAh. Wow, that's a disaster. And we've got one battery that comes out like this. It's our voltage, so it drops down right away when you start it, discharges out. And we've got another one, comes like this. Now these are both 20 amp 2500 mAh batteries. Here's 2500. This might be 2.5 volts. Definitely the end of discharge, but that's sort of, quote, the official. That's the industry standard for a discharge. Now they're both 2500 mAh batteries. They're both 20 amps. The battery B is running down at a much lower voltage. Let's say this is 4.2. This might be 3.9. I don't know, this might be 3.6 or something. Battery A runs at a much higher voltage. Battery B, much lower voltage. Battery A is going to be a much better choice for mech users, but you can't tell just by using 20 amps and 2500 mAh. But for regulated users also, how hard a battery hits is really, really important, because what if we go to 3.2 volts? And we draw a line across. Look at the difference now. We can see that the harder hitting battery not only is good for mech users, but for a regulated battery user at 3.2 volts, battery B, because it's running at a lower voltage, starts at a lower voltage, will reach 3.2 before battery A does. Now how does this relate to watt hours? Watt hours is essentially the capacity times the voltage. So it takes into account what's under here. So the watt hours for B is all that area. Watt hours for A is going to be a larger number because it's going to add on all this stuff. Essentially, it's the area underneath this discharge curve. And you don't really need to know all that. This is just some of the background. Basically, for watt hours, higher number equals more better. So if you're looking through two, if they're both 20 amp, 2500 mAh, and this might be, I don't know, 8 watt hours, and this one might be 6.5. If these are already equal, the higher watt hour number is going to be better, because the 2500 is this part. So the part that makes this higher than this will be the voltage. And that's what you want for regulated and unregulated mods. Now, for internal resistance, what can be important? I should probably go to this side. Internal resistance is going to be more important probably for mech users, but it also determines where you're starting. Here, how much that initial sag happens when you first start the discharge. So it's made of two parts. One is the physical resistance in ohms of the metal inside the battery, the plastic separator between the positive and negative parts. The electrolyte itself, the liquid in the battery, has resistance for the ions flowing through that. All that adds up to resistance, and any resistance means lost power. So lower internal resistance means a more efficient battery, runs cooler, less power running in the battery. The high performance 18650 at 30 amps, you're losing about 18 watts of power inside the battery itself, heating it up, and power loss. It's just very inefficient use of a battery when you're running up at those levels. So to lower the internal resistance, the less power we're losing in the battery, and as a result, the higher the voltage you're going to start at. Also involved is the chemical resistance. We've got ions that need to set up in particular ways, and diffusing in and out of certain things. I set up certain layers and a positive and negative stuff near certain interfaces between compounds. That can take a little time to do. There's an effective resistance, namely what's the equivalent resistance that would cause this voltage drop just because of the way the ions are distributed. We definitely don't need to think about that, but there are two parts to this internal resistance. Now there's AC internal resistance. That you'll find in the data sheets and some of the testing units that you can buy. That's a lower number. That doesn't tell us, though, the voltage drop. That's the DC internal resistance. That's what I will test for. Namely, I give it a pulse, I look at the voltage drop. Let's say I give it a 20 amp pulse or a 10 amp pulse. I look at the voltage drop, and with Ohm's law, I can say, hey, here's the internal resistance. It's a combination of that and that, but it doesn't matter. That's the number. Lower is better. And it'll give you essentially the voltage sag if you want to figure out what you can do with internal resistance. So there's a DC internal resistance number that I will have times the current gives you that initial voltage sag. So if you want the hardest hitting battery, let's say it's 10 milliohms internal resistance at 10 amps, you can get the voltage sag. If it's 20 milliohms times 10 amps, you're going to get double voltage sag. So you'll have, come back on this side again. We'll go back over to here. One will start here, and the other one will start here. Well, obviously, this number up here, let's say if this is 4.2 up here, this is very little voltage sag compared to this. This drop to here is due to a lower internal resistance, less sag. Less resistance times the current, which hopefully we know, will give you less sag. Now, this is a number you subtract from 4.2 wherever you start. This voltage sag is not going to be the number you're running at. So if you've got 20 milliohms, which is a roughly standard number for a good performance 18650, times 10 amps, that's a 0.2 volt sag. So if you start at 4.2, it might drop down to 4.0 or whatever, depending on where you start. It doesn't run at 0.2 volts. That's just what you subtract. Now, this does not include the voltage drop inside your mod, which can be significant. The voltage drop through the contacts, through any particular wiring, through the body, across the threads in a mech, in the atomizer body, in the atomizer connection, through the 510 pin. You can list a dozen different resistances that all will add up and cause power loss in the mod itself, or additional voltage, what I call voltage drop, versus the internal voltage sag of the battery. This will just give you that. But it lets you pick the better battery, namely lower the internal, as I turn around, the lower internal resistance, the battery starts at a higher voltage, the higher watt hour specification, the higher the battery runs at throughout its discharge. It also includes this initial drop, but throughout its discharge, in addition to how long the battery runs. And those two together can help us find the best performing battery. And we'll take a look at some graphs and the numbers for those graphs, just to let you see the association between them, and we'll pick the best performing 3000 mAh battery. Here we see a 15 amp constant current discharge graph for a Sony VTC6, the Samsung 30Q, and an LG HG2. Normally these curves, discharge curves, would be on different graphs, but I pulled the three of them together for easy comparison. Going vertically, along the left you have the voltage from 2.8 to 4.2, and horizontally across the bottom you have the ampere hours, or how long the batteries last. When pulling all three discharges together like this, it's easy to see that the Sony VTC6 in green runs a little bit higher voltage than the others, where I've circled in red, but normally it's three separate graphs, it's a lot harder. You can also see now where I've circled in red that the VTC6 runs for a little bit longer than the other two. This also becomes a lot easier with all three together, but it's a lot harder to do with separate graphs. But when using the internal resistance spec that I'll be giving each of the batteries I test, you can easily see that the Sony VTC6 at 21.4 milliohms, that's 0.0214 ohms, it's a lower number, so less resistance, less battery sag, so it runs at a higher voltage. The Sony VTC6 is lower than the 30Q and HG2. So with just these numbers here, it's easy to see that the Sony VTC6 will run, at least at the start, because that's what these numbers tell you, the very, very start, first few milliseconds, the Sony VTC6 will start at a higher voltage. It can also mean it'll run at a higher voltage along the discharge, but certainly at the beginning it runs higher. If we multiply the 15 amp current by the internal resistance, namely for the VTC6, 0.0214 times 15 amps, then you can get the actual voltage sag for a battery at the start of a discharge. And in the case of this VTC6, it's 0.32 volts. So whatever you started at, if we had 4.2 volts, you would subtract 0.32 volts from it, and you know where you started. And we can see, at least at 15 amps, the voltage sag for all three batteries is pretty close. There's only a tiny difference, 0.04 volt difference between them. And if you go over to the very, very, very first part of the graph, you can see they're kind of all just blurred together. Not where they start to come out, but I'm talking right up against the left-hand wall. In the third column, we show the watt hours that each of the three cells reached, but this time at 10 amps. First, we'll take a look at, even though the graph shows you 15 amps, let's take a look at the 10 amp numbers and compare them. Well, I got 7.72 watt hours from the Sony VTC6, which is about 0.2 watt hours higher than the Samsung 30Q and the LG HG2. Notice that at 10 amps, the 30Q and HG2 are almost identical, 7.53 watt hours and 7.51, with the Sony VTC6 being about 0.2 watt hours higher. Now that means either that the VTC6 ran longer or at a higher voltage and at the same time, or maybe a little bit less. But either way, it makes the VTC6 the better performer of the three at 10 amps. But if we go up to 15 amps, look what happens to the watt hour ratings. VTC6 is still ahead at 6.51 watt hours. Samsung 30Q, the same, approximate 0.2 watt hours behind the VTC6, or below, I should say. But now look what happens to the HG2, 5.87. And that's what we're seeing on the discharge graph, namely that the HG2 at 15 amps is behind the 30Q, and the 30Q is behind the VTC6. So just with watt hour specifications, we can say, hey, the 30Q and HG2 are about the same at 10 amps, but once we get up to 15 amps, and even more so at higher current levels, the 30Q is going to outperform the HG2, not only with a slightly lower internal resistance in the first column, but also with a higher watt hour rating. But the Sony VTC6 is still the champ. And we can see that by all four columns, with the VTC6 has the lowest internal resistance, the lowest voltage sag, the highest 10 amp watt hour rating, and the highest 15 amp watt hour rating. So what's the best performer for the 3000 mAh 18650 Shootout? Sony VTC6. Now, does that make it the best cell, best 3000 mAh cell? Well, maybe not, because there's price, which may be your priority, and there's also cycle life. Last time I did cycle life tests, the 30Q actually held up better after 200 cycles, 200 full discharge recharge cycles, held up better than the VTC6. Now I'm running those right now, but it's going to be a couple of months before I have the answer. So the best overall battery between these three may not be the VTC6 if you're looking for the longest lasting battery. But certainly in terms of performance right out of the box, the Sony VTC6 is the winner. Thanks for watching.